Alright, Paul. Just the first impressions of this thing. So first of all, this little IEC thing, I'm thinking it might be possible to mount this connector directly into the back of the machine. I do actually have a couple different power cords we could use for this, and it fits in the back. Or I actually have two of the original Teac power cords, like these little gray ones. So I have one for my Teac, and this is an extra one. So then on the front of this thing, the pinch roller is kind of gummed up, which is normal for something this old, so that'll have to be pulled apart with the linkages and have the old grease removed. Otherwise, there's standard issues. I just powered this up briefly, and the flywheel here doesn't turn this capstan when the thing's running, so that's likely a drive belt issue. You can get those on eBay. I'm just going to show a little bit of the teardown of one of these. So of course, this pinch roller linkage arm here is all gummed up, so that's going to need to have the old grease cleaned out and have new grease applied. So the pinch roller itself pulls out. And there's this little cover piece going over the capstan bearing in here. And you take the head cover off. You take these little rubber parts out of each of these reel tables. And you have 3 screws under each reel table. And I think there's metal spacers beneath these, or there should be anyway. So, alright, so now I've removed 3 of the screws from each reel table. I'm hoping those spacers are still present. The reason for these is to keep these at the proper height off of the faceplate, just to keep everything aligned properly. Going through the head assembly. So there's 2 on this side. I'm going to label these so I know they came off of the right side. And the left side also has 2. So I'm just going to keep these all separate. And then you have these 2 screws on each side that hold the faceplate on. I know on the actual 4010S model, I think there's a second screw here holding this pivot arm in place. So again, I'm not sure if this screw here was added or if that's how these originally came. Right, now I've removed the head cover, and there's the old drive belt turned to tar. So that happens with stuff this old. Just gets kind of melted, so it's in there. But I found out a trick on how to get this stuff off your hands. That's to use baby oil. And you want to see all the Loctite on each of these adjustment screws to make sure none of that's tampered with, because it's next to impossible to get everything back in alignment with these adjustments for your head azimuth unless you have really expensive equipment and alignment tapes. These particular 4010 models had 4 heads in them. You'd actually have a reverse playback head for your reverse direction. That's how it's able to play the tape in both directions without physically having to turn the reels over. So you have your erase head on the far left, then your reverse playback head, then your record head, and then your forward playback head. Now, just as a note to myself, to keep from losing these reel table screws, I just put them back in here, and I put the rubber piece back in so these won't fall out. I'm going to keep the spacers separate with each one. And for other smaller screws, I have these tiny little Ziploc bags I keep them in. So, to get the rest of the faceplate off, we have these 2 screws, and the 4 corner screws. Alright, I think this is slightly different to the original 4010S model. I tried to remove the faceplate and it was hung up by this tension arm here. There's actually a square hole in here, so that couldn't have been something somebody modified, I wouldn't think. And this also has a corresponding square part here. So that's kind of different to the earlier Teacs. I think normally there's a spring mechanism behind the faceplate, and the whole arm is held on from behind. So this is probably a bit different since this is newer. But anyway, the standard 4010S still look the same inside. So, with the faceplate off, I'm going to try to get the remnants of the old belt out of here. Anyway, then you have this switch here. So this is switching between 50 and 60 hertz for your line frequency. A lot of these are multi-voltage machines you can run in other countries. So you keep the switch to the bottom for 60 hertz in the US. And then there's actually stepped pulleys. So this is your flywheel here. It's got steps on it. And your main capstan motor in the center has a step pulley. And those are different diameters for the 50 and 60 hertz operation. So the 60 hertz should be on the rear step of each of these pulleys. Then there's this little rubber pad, which is kind of deteriorated a little bit, but that's meant to keep these buttons straight and to pad everything for smooth operation. And here's this linkage mechanism, which gets all gummed up, so this whole mechanism of the linkages will have to be torn out, cleaned up, and re-greased. Because for this to operate properly, this should just be able to return on its own. Like this should spring right back when you lift it up. And this is all gummed up, so there's old grease in here. The counter belt is up here. There's a little bit of slack in here, but the counter was still operating, so it should be fine. That's not a big deal. So as for replacing the main drive belt, you also have to get into the back of the deck. Then there's 4 screws in the back to remove this entire metal bracket arm here. So there's like 1, 2, there's a third one here, and one on the end back here. So those all have to be removed when you get into the back of the deck. And this entire assembly comes out. I think even the head assembly might have to be moved out of the way, so that assembly for the head block is held on by these 2 top screws on the outside. And you definitely don't want to mess with any of these other screws with the Loctite, because that'll screw up your head alignment. Now to get into the back, you just remove all the screws on the perimeter for this wood cover. Alright, so now we're into the back. There's a lot of dust, so obviously this has to be cleaned up. Anyway, you have the main chassis part of the unit. This bottom part is just for the record amplifier. This is a bit different than some of the 4010S models, and mine in particular is an early one. Anyway, there's wiring running from the outputs from the heads into this amplifier down here. They might have removable plugs inside here, I'm not exactly sure quite yet. But from the front of the cabinet, you can still remove the entire deck and the amp separately. You got your transformer here, your AC motors. These resistors are for the motor torque. And you've got some filter caps. And your motor run caps are still inside, and those have date codes on them so you can know what year and month this was made. This remote socket thing here needs to be present for the deck to operate. If that's missing, I think it would be inoperative. But you either put this plug in there or There's an optional accessory that had a remote for the transport buttons on it, so you could operate the deck with some remote and be across the room however long the cable was, I don't know. Alright, a couple of these screws on this side were missing, I'm not sure why, but this panel folds down here just to move it out of the way. But be careful not to put too much strain on the wiring in here. There's even still more remnants of the old drive belt in there I'll have to remove. And then you have your run caps for each of the AC motors. So these are all rated for 250 volts AC. And they typically have date codes printed on them. So I have to see what they say as to what year and month this thing was made, just out of curiosity. So here's the main run cap. It's got a couple of capacitors inside the single can in there. But this says 71-9, so that's September of 71. So when this was made, which is kind of cool. Then under these parts here, I think you have at least 1 or 2 relays. So some of the relays inside these things get dirty with their brass contacts. So the relays are actually used as part of the electronics that engage your auto reverse mechanism. And sometimes if the auto reverse doesn't work, then you might have to take like a business card or something just to run it through the contacts to clean off any oxidation. You don't want to use anything abrasive for those relay contacts if you can even get them apart. I didn't mention this yet on the front, but there's this little sensor here, and that's part of the auto reverse mechanism too. Because when you operate the deck, you can hit either of these buttons here to switch directions, or at the end of a tape you can have sensing foil put on the outside or the backing of the tape. And once that sensing foil goes past this little sensor, I think they're electrodes or something, but then it'll trip that relay, and this can automatically change directions and reverse itself without even pressing these buttons. But that's only if you have sensing foil spliced onto the end of the tape on the outside. Something else I wanted to point out, in addition to cleaning this up, the other thing is lubrication. So the motors themselves need to be lubricated. And I know at least for the main capstan motor, these decks actually have oiling tubes. The capstan motor itself has 2. There's the one here, and there's one further back. But just take a syringe, just put some oil down these tubes a little bit to lubricate the motors. I think these other ones should have an oiling tube also, but it's kind of less obvious where they're located. Alright, so one screw is here. Second one is behind the bundle of wiring right here. The third one is up here. I think this one right here. And the fourth one is actually like kind of inside or behind part of these switch controls right in there. So yeah, I'll have to cut into these a little bit and get all that out. Okay, I've got the rest of this torn apart now. I removed those main 4 screws through the back, and they held in this entire large bracket holding the flywheel here. So then I took out these top screws holding in the entire head block assembly, and then these little guide things came out from these long screws holding that in place. So this one went on the left, this one on the right. For the pinch roller arm assembly, it's just this entire part here. which is where the old grease is, so this desperately needs to be cleaned. So to take this out, a lot of times if this was completely seized, you actually have to take a heat gun and heat this whole arm and just pull it straight out with channel locks. So you have to pop this E-clip off, and this piece should slide out, and it's just caked with old grease on the inside. It's just kind of gotten sticky and gummed up, and this whole thing's pretty dirty on the inside, so definitely needs a good cleaning anyway. Okay, I popped off the E-clip. There's also this little spring. I don't know if it's really gonna pull straight out as a result of all this old grease. I got this linkage piece off. So this is the shaft that goes on here. There's just a ton of sticky old grease. Shaft here needs to be cleaned up. I think this was actually one of the screws in the back I loosened that I thought removed that front arm piece. So I might just have to tighten this up a bit more. But thankfully I got that off. Got some Q-tips with alcohol and cleaned this out. Just want to clean this shaft in here with alcohol. So here's the white lithium grease. So you want to lubricate both parts of this, the shaft and this arm inside. Okay, E-clip's back on, that's good to go. Nice and free moving. I put a little bit of grease on some of the other moving pivot points along this linkage here. And there's also the capstan bearing I wanted to lubricate, which is actually on here with this whole flywheel assembly. And I mentioned about those oil tubes to lube the motors before. So that's part of the lubrication too. I just want to get this functioning mechanically. And after the belt arrives, then move on to the electronics and testing this record amplifier and see if this passes a signal and that the audio's clean and all that. Otherwise you might have to delve into this whole record amplifier if it needs any components replaced, like old capacitors or whatever. This was kind of a big deal just to get this operating properly again. And this tar from the old belt is just all over me. But we're having fun. So here's the flywheel. Here's this whole bracket. It's got to put oil in this bearing. It's probably bone dry. I gotta get this cleaned up. Alright, so I kind of got this repositioned back in here just so I can partially reassemble it. So I don't have it all torn apart and forget where things go when the belt arrives. This will be held up here in place again, and then this is your pinch roller arm. It springs back nice and freely, just like it should. For these little guides here, I think these are part of the tape guides that might go under the head block if I'm not mistaken. But this little bracket goes on here with two small screws with those tiny little washers there. Before I put all that back together, there's a part of the wires that were wrapped around this section of this bracket with one of the wire ties going around, so I kind of want to put this back properly for the head block to be correctly reassembled. Okay, so now I have the head block reassembled on this main bracket here. So it's difficult to reassemble, but that little bracket in the center with the two small screws went in, and there's, I think, 4 different sets of wires in here, so we have 2 pairs on each side of that bracket, and it goes through the center. And also, I don't think I mentioned this when I was taking this apart, but in order to entirely free this whole bracket out of the machine, I had to take off this sensor here for the sensing foil, like these little electrodes. So this just goes in front of here, there's a single screw holding that on. I just put that back in here for safekeeping. But I had to take this off to free this whole bracket and get it out and removed. This is mostly reassembled now. So then when the belt arrives from eBay, I can probably just have enough clearance to pull this back slightly to have enough clearance behind it to get the dry belt stretched around the flywheel here and around this inner pulley down here. Anyhow, after that main belt's replaced, you go back in the rear of the unit and reinstall the 4 screws holding this bracket in place just to secure that back down to the chassis. After I get this working mechanically, which the main part of the battle is over with just this gummed up pinch roller arm here, so that's freed up. Actually, I'm not sure about this other arm here, the little tension arm on the left. Might need to look into that, because typically that's a spring-loaded thing on some older Teacs, ones earlier than this specific one. So I don't know if this whole thing here needs to pivot or not, and if that's seized up with old grease. I'm not too sure off the top of my head, but... And I don't know if you know this, but there's a button here. You can see it on the face plate if I show this here. But it says tape tension, push for 1/2 mil. So, with the 7-inch tapes, there's different thicknesses depending on the length of tape. A long playing tape would be thinner. So I think if you have maybe a 3600 foot tape or maybe a 2400 foot also, it might only be 1/2 mil thick. So this just releases some of the back tension so it won't stretch your tape or snap it. I think it also adjusts the amount of torque on these little brake pads in here too. If you have extra thin tape, you would push this in. One other thing I noticed, this is still one of the earlier Teacs, or at least early enough to still use those rubber reel holders. So you just put them on these reel table shafts and they prevent the reels from flying off, especially with fast forward and rewind. So I saw in this bag a couple of those tapes. There's only one of those original reel holders in here. And a couple of my old Teacs had these flat puck style ones, and these aren't even very deep, so they don't really work at all. But I just noticed you only had one of these in the bag anyway, so I have these rubber feet like I said, so probably fit around here and should work fine. Just to go on like that. I think these are already pretty good. It's probably about 1/4 of an inch. So that should just go over the end and hold your reel on. So just as a rough idea, these should be sufficient. Not terribly oversized, but keep everything secure. So these should work well enough for that anyway. When I was putting this head block back together, there were the 2 smaller guides that go between a couple of the heads in here, so those just go through the holes in the back against the metal plate of this head block. They're kind of just the slots like this vertically, so you put those 2 guides through and then they lift up and down in here like that. So that's pretty much it for now until I can get that belt in the mail and throw it in here. Otherwise, in the meantime, I can just work on cleaning this up and getting some of the dust out. And of course, the other thing with all the dust and dirt inside is just trying to clean all the switches and potentiometers. So I have some of my deoxit cleaning chemical for electrical contacts, and probably just spray all the switches and pots in here to get everything properly cleaned out. Because I think even when I briefly turn this on, I just turn this output level potentiometer in here. Of course, these are dual gang pots for your left and right channels, but I just turned this a little bit and I noticed some noise on the meters there. And I don't know if you had this powered up recently or not, but all the lamps seem to work. Actually, I didn't test the record mode. There's also these red lights here, so when the deck's put into record mode, you'll have solid red lights above the meters here. The meter lights worked. Then you have your pilot light in here that was working, so that's all good. So I'll wrap it up for this video and probably make the next video if I get the belt installed and get everything else cleaned up.